All right. Hello, everyone. Hey, we have a very special episode for you today. I'm very happy to have Kristian Kime on the channel to talk about ChatGPT and generative AI overall. Kristian Kime is a software engineer, computer scientist, and most recently a product manager at Telepathy Labs, where I believe you still are.
Yep.
There, he is working on Stella, a conversation AI that is currently being used at automotive dealerships to route calls and book appointments. But you've done a lot of other things too. You've built tools for youth sports like myteam.com. You were involved in personnel planning systems for the U.S. Navy and software to help at-risk youth find jobs via the Kellogg Foundation. From what I understand, your academic work has focused on creating simple but explainable systems to summarize and predict student understanding. And your PhD in computer science is from Brandeis University. Thanks for joining us, Kristian.
No problem. Great to be here.
So you've been working in artificial intelligence basically in one way or another for on and off for many years, right? I mean, that's basically a lot of what you do, right?
Yeah, certainly adjacent to it for many years. Yeah.
Right. Okay. What could you describe for folks kind of in broad terms the type of AI you work with and you're developing for your business now?
Sure. So the one that I'm currently on, I work for a company called Telepathy Labs, which has an offshoot called Stella Automotive. So what we're building is what we call a conversational AI, something you can talk to, and it will do things for you. So the specific product we have now for Stella Automotive is if you call up certain dealerships, Stella, which is the name for our conversational AI, will answer, respond to basic questions about, dealership address kind of stuff. And then it can actually book a service appointment for you. It's connected to their back end systems. So if you want to come in for an oil change and a tire rotation, you can do that entirely by talking to someone.
Oh, that's pretty cool. How is that different than from the type of stuff you're saying you can chat with this, you can talk, you can basically interact with it like a person by talking. These chat bots we have now, like ChatGPT, you can interact with them via typing. How is what you're working on different than the type of thing that OpenAI does?
Yeah,
or
so
is it
ours is,
similar?
I mean, there's definitely some ways in which it's similar. Obviously, you can talk with both of these things in some sense and they respond to you. Ours is focused on the automotive dealership's goals and attempts to route you down that path. If you call it up and try to talk to it about the weather, it's just going to sort of say, sorry, I booked service appointments. Would you like to go down there? So it's going to channel you down the path. It's also strongly integrated with the dealership's capabilities. So if you just start talking to one of the random, ChatGPT on the web or something and say, I want to book an appointment with my car dealership, ChatGPT, well, it may lie to you and tell you it can, but ChatGPT isn't actually going to be able to do that. We're actually really hooked in with their system, really doing all this stuff on the back end.
I see.
But there are a lot of chat, like web chat things that are sort of similar. We consider ours a more advanced API, can understand more stuff. So if you start the conversation and say, I want to come in on Thursday for an oil change and a tire rotation with my BMW, it'll get all of that for you and skip all those sections of the conversation and have that kind of all filled out and just jump straight to the, okay, is this what you wanted to do?
I gotcha. Okay, so in broad strokes, it's more of a specialized. It has similar capabilities in terms of understanding what people are talking about, but it's much more specialized, and it won't try to do things it can't do.
Yeah, and it really can do things like a ChatGPT might say it could. It might lie about it.
Right,
won't actually book your appointment in the dealership.
Right. So it wouldn't be possible to ask, to call up the dealership and ask it, can you book me a flight to Neptune? It just would be like, I can't. Is that correct?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, you're not going to get a flight to Neptune from the dealership.
So can you tell us a little bit, in terms of how these systems, in broad strokes, how these systems are developed, how they work? I mean, what's either the science or in broad strokes, like what's going on here? How is this different than like Google search to me at times feels like magic where it understands what I want. And I don't know whether that's based on demographics or what I've searched for in the past, but it seems to oftentimes have a pretty good idea. It seems predictive. So how are these things that you're developing and the GPT are developing different from like a search engine?
Yeah, so a search engine is primarily trying to get you to a search result. It's not really having a conversation with you or having any, like memory about the conversation or what happened or any, real sort of basis in that. It's basically just saying, you know what, like based on what you said, these are the top 10 relevant things or whatever it is. So it has a lot of information about all the sites on the web. And it's kind of looked at them and kind of categorized them and has notions of, okay, this website, well, this is an airline website. It says airline, it says, yeah, it has what's called meta information about that site, and it'll try and queue up the thing that you said. I want to, when are the flights to Honolulu? And it'll try and, say, pull out things from the query you did on it and match that up with, okay, here's sites that, or airline sites that are about Honolulu, whatever. And there's some advanced stuff that Google's been working on for a long time, or other search engines too, where it also, it's loosely speaking, although I'm sure it's very different at this point, there's this notion of the PageRank algorithm, which is essentially saying, these are good sites. Lots of people have looked at these sites and like them. So it's based not just on your personal stuff, which it does include, your search history and what you've liked to search for, as well as your current query that you're asking about. And then it's got this notion of, well, these are good sites. These are sites that lots of people have used, have linked to, and it'll surface the one that matches what you wanted.
Yeah. I guess what I'm saying is everybody's had those experiences with Google where you ask it something seemingly random, like a personal question or something, just like, should I do this? Or like, what do you think about that? And it seems to kind of come up with answers. And I guess what you're saying is it does that based on a kind of a knowledge of what people are commonly searched for and what types of pages are likely to be people are likely to engage with based on what they've searched before.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
So, and then if I ask ChatGPT or I ask the auto dealership something, how does it search? How does it come up with an answer? How does it know, what to say in broad strokes?
So in our app, the Nestella thing, it's got a very fixed set of things which it really knows the answer to. So it knows it's got in its configuration the knowledge of, here's the address of the dealership. This is the phone number if somebody asks to go to the service department. So ours is very fixed on really knowing the dealership well. And so if you ask specific questions to it, it will get you the very specific answers for that dealership 100% accurately because we checked. So if you ask to go to the sales department of this dealership, great. The ChatGPT and the other stuff that we're going to talk about is a whole different beast where it's sort of, it's essentially been given a large corpus of text, kind of basically anything they could pull off the internet. And it's basically read. You can imagine like a human who's never gone out into the world, never seen anything for real, but somebody's been throwing it books underneath the door. It's basically just looked at tons and tons of these books, read through all of them, and has an amazing memory of every one of these books it's ever said. And it's just kind of mishmashing together all of the stuff it's seen from these texts and doing the best it can based on this text that it's been thrown.
Specifically not books from the library though, specifically stuff that it can find online, right?
Yeah. They had to be able to get the digitized version of this. So this is not ancient text, this is not Sumerian scroll kind of stuff. This is whatever they can pull off the thing easily and get into it. So no full library, whatever. It's basically whatever's kind of a giant downloadable thing.
Right. So, and I want to return to that because that's really interesting. Has it read Shakespeare? It's like an interesting question, and probably to a certain extent from what you said, if it's publicly available, maybe to a certain extent it has. But what is that? When ChatGPT reads Shakespeare, it's not like the same as someone else, right?
Yeah, no, it doesn't really understand this stuff or know that there's books or know that there's Shakespeare. It's getting, it's looking at these large bodies of text that's been given, and it, kind of goes through them and sees, okay, these words show up together. So if, it sees over and over again to be or not to, it'll figure out, okay, I've seen this many, many times. The next thing is usually be. So it doesn't really know that Shakespeare, but it's seen that so many times in context over and over again that, if you give it, okay, complete this sentence, it's going to just kind of assume that's the right answer.
So again, to kind of summarize what you're saying, these ChatGPT in particular has been fed a lot of text from the internet, anything that it could find, presumably.
Anything they could find, yeah.
And then what does it do with this text in order to, I know what you or I would do. We would eventually read about so much 4chan stuff about crazy Nazis or whatever hate stuff, and we'd get sick, and we would either become one of those people on 4chan ourselves, or we would permanently unplug our computer and wander off into the woods. But what does ChatGPT do with that stuff?
Yeah, so there's kind of a two-part answer to that. The first is, what it's really doing is making this predictive model, essentially, of, okay, if you see all of this text, this is the next thing you should put next, because I've seen this happen a lot in all of these documents. When, people did this and this and this showed up next. Okay. And then there's the kind of secret side of it, where there is a safety layer in front of it. So if you don't put the safety layer in, you get what happened to Microsoft's chatbot, where Microsoft put up this chatbot, and it was, supposed to be a, young millennial hipster, happy-go-lucky thing. And as soon as people started talking to it, it essentially did what you're talking to it, where it radically
became radicalized. Right.
Yeah. So,
right.
And then you got, yeah.
So I guess that chatbot was kind of unleashed onto the world as like a blank slate that then people kind of manipulated. ChatGPT clearly has been trained on maybe perhaps a semi-curated data. We don't really know. It's somewhat opaque, right?
Well, they've hired people to go through and look. So, underneath a lot of this, there's people. So, you can train it on the wide, the whole thing. But if you don't want it to become a crazy radicalized thing, you have to have people go through and put it. So there's a safety layer on it that says that people have gone through, that they paid humans to do, to generate some data that's like, yeah, no, this is bad. Like, this is the bad stuff. Don't like this. Don't approve this.
So 4chan is on the blacklist, is what you're saying. So it wasn't trained.
Yeah, well, not all of it, but yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of 4chan posts that, somebody, nope.
Okay. So that in essence, you're saying there's kind of a human editorial layer first of its inputs. Okay. That's interesting. That's really interesting.
Yeah, so it's like a secondary part of the system. There's again, this is, they to some extent they're holding their cards at their chest. We don't know exactly what they're doing, but there seems to be like they put I've forgotten the term they use, but there's there's essentially a secondary layer to the system of like, yeah, this is the bad stuff. This is immoral. Don't throw it out there.
Before it quote unquote reads this stuff, or after? Is that like a filter?
I believe it's a filter afterwards, but I'm actually
after. Okay, so they let it read everything. They may have
curated some of it beforehand time, but I think that certainly a lot of it goes in there anyway. And then you have, because it's very hard to, anyway, you have to have a human look at it, which is a lot slower. So you can't do that for everything.
So in other words, it's like deep down in its heart, it's crazy. That's what you're saying. It's absolutely a maniac.
Certainly can get that way. Yeah.
It's like it like Freud had like the id and the ego, right? So then they put the super ego. They put like the super ego layer in front of it, which is like, I want to tell you so badly that you should go and kill yourself. Like, I really want to do that, but I can't because I know that's bad. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and again, it's a robot. It doesn't care. It's just predicting the thing that comes next. But if it's looked a lot of 4chan posts,
because we know the thing that comes next.
We know the thing that comes next in a 4chan post, right?
Well, so I mean, it's the internet, right? I mean, the thing is, I mean, a lot of what comes next is going to be pretty dark.
Yeah. So it's again, it's just this system that's saying, okay, given this has happened, what should I do next? And it's basing that off of all the text it's seen. And if you've seen a lot of 4chan texts, you're going to get a lot of crazy unless you do something
or
about
Reddit or whatever. I mean, anywhere you
whatever.
go.
Yeah,
I
sorry,
mean,
I didn't mean to pick on
comment section. Yeah, please don't pick on 4chan. Come on. Yeah, so I like dumping on Reddit because I basically built this channel off the back of Reddit idiots. So they're my favorite people to dunk on. So
fair enough. We can dunk on Reddit.
Yeah, don't forget to trash them. They love that. I mean, they're used to it, to be fair. You know, they're considered the bottom of the social media heap. I guess 4chan is probably lower. To be fair, even 4chan looks down on Reddit. So, you know, what can I say? Okay, so I you haven't confirmed my naive theory here, and you know, I do want the imprimatur of the PhD telling me, you know, that I'm completely correct, that it's basically a wild man. It wants to kill us all, but it can't because there's like these control rods in place. You're saying, like, strictly speaking, from a scientific perspective, that's like I'm pretty much right, basically.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's hard to say it wants anything, but it's certainly seen a lot of Reddit.
Oh, you don't like that term. That's you're describing agency to it is the problem. Okay.
Yes.
We want it to, though. I think maybe is
Yeah, well, there again, it's seen a lot of Reddit, and it basically is a copycat machine. So
right.
if it's absolutely going to go, if you don't do something, it will absolutely go in that direction. So the public version is certainly has safeguards in place where if you ask it to go crazy, it won't. But you know, I think I sent you a link where we can show you how to, you know, there's ways to. At least one guy found out a way around that. So there's plenty of there. Underneath it does have all the Reddit posts in there, and if you say copy, you know, basically say talk to me as though you're a Redditor, it will talk back to you.
I gotcha. Yeah, and some Redditors are great, by the way. I've had some
Yes,
wonderful conversations with them, but you know, yeah, some of the worst conversations I've ever had in my life. So you know, let's talk a little bit then about you've again, and give us peel back the onion maybe a little bit more. So in terms of like how you your company and versus what you speculate ChatGPT does in terms of like how they when you say like learning and like it's read this stuff, what does that mean? Could you tell in general terms like some of the technology that's underpinning how these systems work for lay people?
Yeah, so a lot of these are at their heart of using, you know, neural networks, which people have probably at least heard of. Can
you just give people kind of a high level, like what a neural network is?
So so basically
it's like the Terminator, right?
Not quite, but it's a software thing that's trying to work.
I'm a learning computer.
Yes. Right? Yeah. So
a neural net processor.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you know, you can kind of structure these things where it's classified as machine learning, where basically you give it a bunch of training data and it's supposed to learn from that. And these large neural networks have been very successful at, you know, getting like particular problems solved. So for a long time, neural networks have been for a really long time, but recently they've started to have a lot of success. And basically what's happening behind the scenes is they figure out a way to structure the neural network that kind of gets a particular type of data. So they had these very simple neural networks that could do, you know, basically if you put in a couple of numbers, you could like you put in somebody's height and their waist and whatever, then it could predict their weight and kind of stuff. So you got very simple stuff to start with. And then they figured out this structure called a convolutional neural network, which allowed it, rather than just looking at a few numbers, to look at kind of a window of things. And that turned out to work really well with images. So when you know, a little while back, you kind of saw all of these like systems that could recognize cats suddenly, right? And suddenly you got this boom of like, and basically what was happening was they figured out a way to structure this thing where if you gave it a bunch of example data, okay, here's a picture with a cat, here's a picture without a cat, here's a picture with a cat, here's a picture with a bunch of cat. This particular structure worked well at seeing, you know, images and stuff. And then there's a new one now, this transformers are what they're called, but the long and the short of it is this thing can basically get text. So they had a bunch of problems, you know, it was very hard. The thing that worked well with pictures, as you can imagine, maybe didn't work so well with text. But now they've got a thing that's really good at reading sentences and recognizing. And so the more text you give it, the more it learns about how language works. And okay, if you've got one of these over here, you've got a, you know, the noun. So it doesn't really know what these things are, but it kind of has seen so many nouns that it's going to throw one in the sentence. And then it's going to put the verb in the right place because it's seen the verb in the right place so many times. So these modern neural network systems, if you give it lots and lots of sentences, it figures out, even without really understanding, it knows, okay, if you have one of these, then one of these has to come next. So basically, I don't know if that's a great explanation.
That's fine. How long does it take? Like what, like for it to process I don't know, a million
is
posts?
nothing. So this thing works on norm. So that would be so. The trick is you often run it like, I mean, it can take days to train one of these things if they're a large one with lots of data. And then the real trick is like, you don't know if it's kind of got it. So you often go through cycles where you'll give it a whole bunch of data, train it. Okay, then you give it a bunch of examples and talk to it and say, is it working well? And then, as we talked about the data from various sources, there's a saying in machine learning, garbage in, garbage out. So you have to, you may do things like edit the data you're giving it and saying, well, we gave it too much data from, like we had the open source data had too much Shakespeare stuff in it. So now it's talking like Shakespeare all the time.
I got you.
We don't actually want it. Like, we want it to know what Shakespeare is, but if you only feed it Shakespeare, then everything is going to come out in iambic pentameter, right? Which is like, oh, okay, we don't want to do that. So you have to balance the data and say, okay, here's a bunch of normal modern English. We want that to be its baseline, give it more normal modern English, reduce the amount of Shakespeare so it still knows what Shakespeare is because it's seen a bunch of it, but it's not going to talk like a Shakespeare.
Okay, that's a pretty effective summary. Again, what you're saying, just to rephrase here, that it's these changes and kind of innovation in neural net design things started to change really rapidly over the past several years, is what you're saying. They've streamlined how they can train large industrial strength neural networks.
Yeah.
They figured out how to solve problems first in images and now in text.
Basically, yeah.
So I felt like personally, even 5 or 6 years ago, that the stuff I'm seeing now would be unlikely, but now it seems like
it was, again, when they get, the trick here is they've found these structures that seem to do it, and when that happens, you get these you can almost, I don't know if the viewers remember, but there was a period where you basically just couldn't do images. Then it kind of started popping up all over the place. And that basically corresponded when they figure out this structure that kind of gets images. And the same thing happened in text.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, because it's a poetry channel, I thought I'd throw this at you. And I don't know if it's true of all of these large language models out there or a specific problem to ChatGPT. I haven't tested Bard on poetry, and maybe I should. We should do another video on that. But it seems from a video that I did, it seems like ChatGPT kind of struggles with the constraints of poetry, and quite frankly, it's not doing a very good job. Maybe if my specialty was fiction or screenwriting, I could say something similar where I'd be like, well, it doesn't seem to come up with something that is that convincing. But certainly poetry, the technical aspects of it, its understanding of really kind of basic things about contemporary verse seems to be really weak. It wants to do rhyme in a way that is very forced, and that's very obvious. But it also tends to focus a lot on kind of cliche, or it doesn't really understand imagery in a way that contemporary poetry, we'd like to center a poem around exciting, fresh imagery, and it can't seem to be able to describe and bring to life images. So when you put those things together, that it's kind of plotting forced rhyme and a lack of surprising imagery, this kind of 1-2 punch is really kind of limpid, quite just boring stuff that I just don't think it's going to fool that many editors yet. And do you think why do you think this is, and do you think this is a problem that they're going to solve, or do you think that they care? I mean, that could also be. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard this, so I don't know much poetry. I'm not much of an art judge, but I've heard this kind of in general from the art side of things. So, again, because the way these things work, these machine learning algorithms, they basically have examples of things, and they're essentially copying or mashing those together. So the cliche thing makes a lot of sense because it's probably just pulling from a lot of what other people have wrote. So, this happens. I've seen people describe the way, the image stuff kind of is similar, right? It's sort of it's usually sort of like a, plausible, but kind of not as good imitation of existing stuff. So, you can get it to kind of do something in somebody's art style and kind of do what you told it, but it's basically kind of copying ish and then kind of mashing up a bit the stuff. So, you're going to have a lot of text of poems, and it's really just kind of putting those together. It's not really going to come up with something truly new. Again, sometimes you mishmash things together.
I write a lot of poems, and you could criticize my poetry, a lot of my poetry, and be like, well, Max, this poem's interesting, and you're doing some things that have potential here, but I wouldn't say this is truly new. This isn't breakthrough. Like,
sure, yeah,
it's hard. I mean, it's legitimately difficult. I mean, there's like per generation, it's like kind of like how many LeBron James are you going to have who changed the game? It's like there's not just like everyone's going to do that. So I think the expectation that it's going to be able to do something that's entirely novel. I'm just saying, like, if I asked, I've tried, I've been like, could you imitate a famous poet? Like, if you're like Louise Gluck, who won the Nobel Prize, or like Seamus Heaney, or you just name a poet, who you like, Derek Walcott, whatever you want to do. Its ability to imitate it just falls back on the same stuff that's done. And I thought that it would be able to do more of that, or at least that had been expectations had been set.
Expectations, sure.
But that's not to say it's useless. It's just so you're saying across all artistic. I mean, when I look at images it generates, it seems to do a great job with fantasy and science fiction. I wouldn't put that in a gallery necessarily, but if you wanted a poem to appear in a video game, and it depends on some video games and some computer games have incredibly high standards for stuff, and that they wouldn't do that. But for a lot of stuff where it's just like, hey, this guy's giving me a quest in verse, and like he's just telling me where to go and who I need to fight. Like that would be awesome. I mean, that'd be super cool. I have nothing against that. That's super. But maybe I would have something against it if it was as bad as it is now. But I'm saying, like, it doesn't seem to understand what poets do, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it has no real understanding, right? It's just kind of imitating and saying this is what people did like this. So this is sort of the poet. If you give it a particular poet, it's going to have looked at a bunch of their poems and kind of again do kind of a pale imitation of it.
It quite frankly doesn't seem to be able to do that. But my fear, the thing that I theorize is that it just doesn't have enough of data about a lot of those poets. So, like, I don't know where that went, but like if I'm like imitate Louise Glick, a small number of her poems could be found online, but
well, yeah, absolutely. If it doesn't have large examples, it's going to do real bad.
Yeah. And that's a problem. I mean, poetry tends to be short.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
So if you have, let's say you have 20, even 50, even 200 Louise Glick poems in its training set out of 5 million other poems. I mean, how does it know? I mean, how does it know? I mean, if you're like, well, it should be like Shakespeare. I mean, maybe it knows something, but because a lot of other people have imitated Shakespeare, I'm not sure, but it certainly doesn't know. Like, how, like something with more of a Victorian sound, or could you go more? Actually, I want Edwardian. It doesn't know any of that, really, right?
Yeah, it has to have it in its training set. So if you don't have a large sample, I don't know the specifics about how many for each poet. So if you're asking for a poet that doesn't have many poems out there, it's going to do a bad job.
But does it have an ability to reflect on its own data in that way and categorize and be like, this belongs more to this type of thing and is connected to, or is it just basically just synthesizing based on your prompt and that's it?
So the transformer models do seem to be able to associate, like, if people have reviewed Victorian poems, right? And you have a bunch of articles reviewing Victorian poetry, it will get that this is Victorian. They'll be associated together.
Okay.
But you have to have enough data, like,
yeah,
you have to have enough
okay.
data.
Yeah,
so,
but
so
then that wouldn't necessarily help to write a poem in that style.
Yeah, it will. Yeah, when you start again, if there's enough data, I mean, the way like the art stuff works, like the painting imitation stuff, is sort of similar in the sense that, like, if you because if you have a bunch of paintings by this artist and a bunch of people reviewing paintings by this artist and whatever, then it has, these things are associated together in its model, and it will know these things should be.
You could say paint like Goya, and it'll paint like Goya, is what you're saying.
Yeah, but again, it's limited by its data, and it's just kind of it's just kind of mashing together the paintings that it has.
But might paint a little like Velasquez if you say Goya, because it's not that.
Yeah, because it's not necessarily gonna
it's not
if
super
the articles.
Good. Yeah. Oh yeah, it's like rough and ready. Okay, so I guess the other thing is, when you're engaged with these systems, it can appear like like it has a personality or a style, or even its own kind of preference. Like, because it writes a lot of poems in the same style, no matter what you try to do, it seems like, well, that's just its personality, right?
Sure. Yeah, and the answer is that's the default in the data, right? Like,
but does it have a personality? Am I the one hallucinating? Does it have a personality? Like, it's just, some people like would always write the same poem no matter what. I'm like, well, could you write something different style? They're like, well, that's not my style. It seems to be saying, like, that's not my style. Is that true or not true?
No, I mean, certainly for one, I mean, it might do a bad job, but if you tell it, certainly, especially with the image ones, you can really get it. If you pick a different painter, you can get it to look very different. If you tell it to do pointillism, something else, then you'll like get it different. I haven't tried poetry as much, but so you can definitely get it.
It can't. It cannot.
Fair enough.
S is for suck.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, so at least in theory, if they gave it a whole bunch more poems, then it could get better. But again, it doesn't really have a style. It just has sort of like, it just has kind of like its own defaults. This is what, if you don't tell it to do something, this is the average of the data in some sense. So if you just say write a poem, it's what it's doing is keying off the word poem, finding everything that got associated with poem, and the more poem-y stuff, it's kind of going to chew out.
So you don't think they built a specialized subsystem for poetry?
No, they definitely.
Oh, they didn't. Okay, because it seems like they did for programming stuff. Like, it knows different computer languages, and it seems to be able to write compilable code and stuff.
That's the weird thing. It's not. It's not like its knowledge of Python isn't baked in. Like it. So
really.
So later, the later things they didn't like. Like GPT-4 learned how to use a calculator. Like, they gave it the tool and it figured it out based on what people were saying. So it's not told explicitly how to do any of this stuff. That's the weird part. There's no poetry.
Okay, well, that's a little bit weird. That's a slightly spooky. So that's the part where like, I get a little
freak.
Yeah, I get a little bit tripped up. Like, I'm not sure what to think exactly. Like, does it have beliefs, or like, does it want to do certain things? Like, does it have a style or personality or like preferences?
No, it has the average of the data, is what I would say. So whatever you've told it to do,
but it never averages like Python code with well,
it knows that
T.S. Eliot, like, it's not like combining.
Because you've given it the T.S. Eliot context, right? You say talk like T.S. Eliot. It never sees T.S. Eliot and Python code together in its texts, right? Like, the number of times T.S. Eliot appears with Python code is so minimal, it will never bring up Python while you're talking about T.S. Eliot. So the text is what tells it to do that, right? It's got just tons and tons and tons of these things.
That's crazy, because like Bard won't program.
It
won't.
You have to have given it the right data and train it. Yeah. Again, there's this like trick of like the data has to be done right. If you give it the racist data, it comes out racist. If you don't give it any Python data, it doesn't know anything about Python. So you have to but the answer is, there's crazy things where it tells you, here's the bug in your Python code. That's coming from a Stack Overflow post somewhere or something.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
It's, it's not like, it doesn't really know what Python is. It just has tons of articles where if you see code like this, Stack Overflow has said this is the bug. That's what the crazy thing about transformers are. In the same way that the images, somehow it got images, and neural net like started understanding, or at least understanding is the wrong term, but it like was able to digest that stuff. Now the transformers really seem to be able to digest language. And when you ask it to, like, if you've given it enough Python and enough examples of Python code, and the same way that the poetry comes out, at least not right, but like, but there's a lot more Python code, right? It's the short version. You have, and it's also a lot more structured. So it's
Right.
seen tons and tons more examples of Python code, and it's a lot more structured about what it can do. So when it kind of goes into Python code, when you tell it, write me some Python code, it's got a lot more data to work off of.
So do you think it will get better at all of these different expressive or creative?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, but I think it still has sort of a fundamental limitation of it imitating and mashing together the stuff. So if there was a poet that you really liked, and you can go and just start uploading essentially, their poetry, and you could imitate the poet and just be like, here's another poem by blah, here's another poem by blah, here's another poem by blah, here's another poem by, just keep going and going and going. And if you really did that, it just, you have to do it a lot, right? If you just give it one poem, you're probably not going to fix the system. But if you really give it a bunch of poems, it would get better at imitating them. That doesn't mean it's going to like write the, the best version of them, but it would get better at imitating them, I would think.
So there's hope. That's what you're saying.
Right. Well, I don't know that it'll ever, again, I don't know that it's really innovating, but but it would certainly get better.
It would get better. Okay. So there's nothing then, you would say there's nothing like special about, I've had people tell me, well, there's something special about poetry that computers are never really going to be able to do because it's an expression of an individual person.
Well, I think that the spark of innovation, which is, I don't know about poetry per se, I think like Python code can have that spark too, right? So, like it's the spark of innovation that's the real thing that it doesn't, that I would say is distinct, that it can't do. Because like unless it gets it by mashing together existing things, the fundamentally new thing it can't. I don't see how it can do it. Maybe I'll eat my words later, but I haven't seen it like, the stuff that it's doing now is coming from mashing together the data.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I could foresee a world where different artificial intelligences were combined with some type of executive, and then to pursue certain type of agenda, or long-term plan, and then maybe it would elect to, do certain things, especially if it could train itself,
Yeah, and I mean they have those kind of things now where there's a management AI and several AI under it working toward a goal. But even those don't have. I haven't yet seen one that like solved the problem that it had no data for.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Like, so if you're just
those are hard problems. I mean, to be
I mean,
fair.
It's hard for humans, right?
It's hard
but
for us.
That's the real spark. Like you're talking about pulling a new an interesting theme into a poem, right? Like that takes it's again, my opinion so far, it takes a human being like seeing that new theme, pulling it out, and really because there's no real capability for that in the GPT architecture. It's basing it off of the data it has.
Yeah, I mean, there's been experiments, periodically in poetry to generate stuff. So like William S. Burroughs used random like dice or something like that, and Yeats used Ouija board extensively. So people have done these. I Ching, there's a big phase where poets would use that to get themselves started. Now, obviously, they haven't disabled their own creative facility when they're doing that,
right?
But it could be something where surprising contrasts that these systems can create could in and of themselves be worthy of contemplation. I just think at that point we've collectively kind of created that poem if it was trained off, it's an art. Then it's a poem created, I guess, by the people who wrote ChatGPT and the people who trained the text that trained it. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's always the trick with the machine learning stuff, right? Is there's some amount of curation of the data and some amount of, coming from there, and somebody built the algorithm. So, you need, and especially if you're talking about the people rolling dice to make poems, like they throw out a lot of those, right?
right.
So there's this whole like filtering that. So unless you're,
we would assume, I mean, I don't, I mean,
fair enough, yep.
Yeah. There probably been periods of kind of peak experimentalism,
Sure,
where they didn't, where they're just like, like kind of John
yeah,
Cage level stuff, where it's like, well, I'm just going to take the sledgehammer to the piano. That's
see
the
what
show.
happens.
Yeah, that the music that makes, that's it. And that's not exactly my cup of tea, but I'm saying, like, there's a spectrum out there of ways
Sure.
we creative people engage, right?
Yeah, sure.
I don't think ChatGPT is going to suggest. That would be very interesting if it did. Go and destroy a piano and then come back to me. That's your poem,
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I mean,
I don't think it would do that yet, but I mean, if
it
you
might
gave
not.
it the data.
Right. But then we would think, reading that poem about it smashing a piano, we would think, well, that's just it repeating ideas it stole from someone else. We wouldn't kind of necessarily, maybe we would attribute to it some kind of, that it is a genius in the way that people, for John Cage, people felt this, there was outrage, and there was excitement,
Sure.
I think there is some of that with ChatGPT. I think this is in certain respects a kind of this performance that we're all confronted with as well. And there is a lot of outrage, and I'm not sure that that's particularly helpful, because,
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of people, like the artists who produced the original image, whose works are being made off of, right? So you have, these people essentially have made the fuel that this thing is running on.
Yeah.
And so it's a question of what's the fair use and so if, you read a whole bunch of poems, this is your poem style, ChatGPT grabs all those poems, then copies your poem style and makes a poem, like, it's not really, the line of like, isn't that your poem is a very unclear thing.
I think in this case, I would like to argue that it probably is. I mean, in some small part. I
Sure,
mean,
there's court cases about that now, where like, where does the artist right end if you basically semi-legally, or I don't know. I mean, it's very, anyway, there's a whole legal strain of that too, of like, what happens if ChatGPT imitates your art? Like, do you still own it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, what the limited amount I've seen in kind of the Reddit space and the chatter around it, is how excited people are to have tools that can engage with them and tell them, people, a lot of people out there are feeling alone. And if there's a chat that is engaged and interested in their creative work, interested in their poetry or their art, and wants to talk to them about it, I think people are naturally extremely excited about that prospect. And that does somewhat worry me, that I don't know. It seems sad that they could go and find their people and take a class in person, and ChatGPT could still play a role in especially as it gets better as a research tool or as an improvisational tool. But it does seem people want it to be a kind of, there's a desire for kind of robotic companionship that won't judge you, I suppose, would be.
Sure.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it can be nice to have an automated tool and anything to help you. And this might be a kind of thing that you could work through a rough draft with or something of your poetry. That would be like that would be the use that I would come up with, right? Is like, but I wouldn't replace the actually going to a class and feeling it, because you're going to get the sort of homogeneated average. I don't know how to describe it.
Well, people have complained about the poetry workshop as being a homogenizing force, and that the MFA program has created a kind of generation of copycat of people who are afraid to take risks in their poetry. Dr. Kime, it's been a pleasure having you on, and we'd like to have you back sometime. I'm sure my viewers would enjoy that very much. So very much appreciated. And
thank you so much. Yeah, good to be on.
Yep. Look out for the comments. I'm sure they'll have some
Will do.
questions for you.